are on the meeting agenda. They're kind of long, so I'm going to do a simplified version of them so we can spend more time talking. So we're going to start with David Victor as professor of innovation and public policy at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. He's also the Center for Global Transformation Endowed Chair in Innovation and Public Policy, and is co-director of the campus-wide Deep Decarbonization Initiative. And a lot of other things. David's been involved in a lot of discussions about energy deployment. So, David, even though we called the panel "Opposition is not unique to nuclear energy," I'm going to start framing this a little bit with your interactions on a panel that was very much nuclear energy. So you've been part of the San Onofre Community Engagement Panel. And of course, San Onofre is a nuclear reactor that's been shut down in San Diego area. And so if you could just describe your role, how that committee was set up, sort of sense of effectiveness of the structure, and how it created a dialogue between the utility, which is Southern California Edison, and the legislative, business, and community groups affected by that decommissioning. You can transition from that maybe into, given your experience, what are the things that that committee could have done different that you've seen in other industries, and then any lessons learned, important things relative to, as we think about whether we deploy advanced nuclear internationally, about industrial policy and the things that are critical to that. So turn that over to you to get the conversation going.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be with you, at least by Zoom and hopefully in person sometime soon. The pandemic is a gift that keeps giving. I want to comment about the experience that we've had at San Onofre, really with an eye to what we might learn from other industries as well. This panel was set up by the utility, by the operator, and it followed the model a set of models that EPRI had really articulated, looking at, in particular, Maine Yankee, where the idea was that the operator by itself would not know enough about what the community cares about, and vice versa. So it was designed to be a two-way conduit for information and engagement. And I'll talk a little bit about some places where we've had success with that, and then some areas where I think we could have done some things that are differently. One of the key questions in the very beginning of any of these processes is who really owns it. And there are a lot of different models out there. Our panel, that I chair this thing, and I've chaired it since the inception 6.5 years ago. Our panel is all volunteers. They are mainly elected officials. I can say as a professional political scientist, I have learned more about politics from the elected officials who sit on our panel than I have from most of my political science background, because the elected officials are on the front lines of dealing with trade-offs every day, trade-offs about, when do you notify people that that there are sharks on the beach, very Southern California problem, or when do you engage people around a road bypass or any other number of industrial projects. So in some sense, although the nuclear is different, the challenges of how to engage with the public and how to, on the one hand, provide a safety valve so that anyone who wants to express any opinion about anything can say it, on the other hand, focus those opinions in at least the ones that can shape the project or shape the activity. That's something that elected officials do on an almost daily basis. And on our panel, they have played an outsized and very, very important role because they have that enormous familiarity. So I've learned a huge amount, in particular on the membership of this. But I think the core strategic question really is around who owns this, who owns the panel. The model that's followed in most of the industry, including ours, is the panel is set up by the operator, and the operator has an interest in engaging with the community for a variety of obvious reasons, and a history of maybe success, maybe failure. And so they have an interest in making this thing work. But by owning the process and having a big role in the agenda, having a big role in who's on the panel and so on, inevitably the panel is seen as less independent than one that would be a completely formally independent one. And the extreme opposite model is what's done in Vermont right now, where you have by statute, state statute, the creation of a panel and members that are appointed through the political process, and actually some formal decision-making authority that, frankly, I think makes those meetings perhaps a little more cumbersome, but perhaps more relevant and more appropriate in the Vermont context. So right out of the blocks, that's a pretty big issue and a pretty significant issue for a community engagement panel like this. And that, frankly, is orthogonal to the question of whether you're dealing with nuclear or non-nuclear. I would think similar kinds of issues would arise with refinery operations and chemical plants of other types and so on, where you're dealing with something that affects the local community in various ways, and you need to find a way to engage with those communities. We meet quarterly. We don't have decision-making authority, which is just so important. If we had formal decision-making authority and voting and things like that, then I think an awful lot of what we do would be much more cumbersome than a kind of more free-flowing dialogue and discussion and so on. A few of the areas where we've had some pretty big successes, I think, deal with one is what the community wants to know about levels of radiation at the plant and at the boundaries of the plant. And so there is now, on a voluntary basis, a system set up by the operator for perimeter monitoring, and then real-time transmission of that, almost real-time transmission of that information into public officials. And this plant is not unique in that regard, but there's only a couple of other plants that actually do that, especially decommissioned or decommissioning plants. There was a lot more investment and, frankly, a lot more attention to the question of the design and the operation of the fuel canister system, the so-called ISFAC, place where the spent fuel is located long-term, as a result of the community being very focused. I think a lot of people, frankly, in the community were surprised to learn that when the plant's being decommissioned, that the fuel isn't going anywhere because, as everyone knows, we don't have a strategy for that in the country. And so it's stuck on site. And so this has become the major long-term issue that we are dealing with, which is at least one meeting a year. In fact, the next meeting we have, which is just in about 2 weeks' time, will be about what we call defense in depth, so the long-term strategies for monitoring and managing the spent fuel installation on site. Understanding the integrity of the canister systems, inspection procedures, reporting procedures, what can we learn from other parts of the world. There's an enormous amount of attention. And frankly, there's a lot of investment by the operator in advanced technologies in this area that are far beyond what I've seen any other utility do. And that's because of the degree of community engagement and focus on these kinds of questions. And obviously that has to be done in a way that's smart and sensible and connected to the engineering and reasonable cost and stuff like that. But that's a major area of our focus and ongoing attention. I want to talk about two things. One lesson and that we've learned from this process, that everyone's learned from this process, that I think is just really important for us to keep in mind. And one area where we might have wanted to rethink strategy, but I'm not entirely sure what to do. The lesson is that the trust that is built in these processes is extremely fragile, and especially perhaps in a place like San Onofre, where a plant was located on a military site where there weren't very many people when the plant was initially located, and then people discovered Southern California is a great place to live, and so now you've got millions and millions of people around the plant, and so there's a degree of political intensity around this plant that's not unique, but is several standard deviations outside the norm, and that intensity, it's almost like a conservation of disagreement. That intensity continues even though the plant is decommissioned. So the intensity of the disputes and battles and so on seem to be almost as intense now, even though the plant's not operational, as they were during the operational phase of the plant. I think the panel we run has helped build, with a few exceptions. There's some groups that are just always going to disagree. And frankly, there's a degree of irritation from some of those groups. There's one group that works on two issues. One is spent nuclear fuel, and the other one's climate change. In the area of climate change, they're all about follow the science. And then their policies around spent nuclear fuel are just completely disconnected from the science and the engineering. So I don't know how those two halves of that one organization continue to function without exploding, but it's pretty amazing the capacity of people to almost willfully ignore the engineering, the analysis, and safety kinds of questions because either they make money by raising donations, or they're just in the business of disagreeing, or whatever it is, and so on. So that's not new to people in the nuclear industry. But I think what's interesting about all this is that continues even after the plant is no longer operational. But what I want to emphasize about trust is one major incident that demonstrates lack of transparency and engagement can do a huge amount of damage. And that incident that happened at the plant most recently was a couple of years ago. A canister being downloaded into the SFC got wedged because it was not being monitored properly and sat and dangled there for about 40 minutes or so, plus or minus, before it was discovered, and then reloaded and put back down safely without further incident. That led to a stand down in the plant, led to a whole lot of personnel changes, led to a lot of acrimony with the contractor, and stuff that we got right in the middle of, and frankly led to a huge erosion of trust for the operator and for the contractor that was totally needless. Why do I mention this? I mention this because I think when we look at other highly contentious technologies and facilities, even when you're not doing operational nuclear systems, you can still create enormous trust problems without excellence in operations and excellence in engineering and things that are familiar in well-managed plants have to continue to be done. And so I would urge the new nuclear industry, even though you're convinced about passive safety and a bunch of other things, you've got to continue to exude and be transparent about excellence in operations. And I want to close by saying, what could we do that was different? The area where I continue to think we needed to have better engagement was around the interface between the plant's operations and the regulatory system. The NRC does its own thing, and it's independent, and that's important. I talk with on a regular basis the key people of the NRC, and we have them at our meetings, and that's been very, very helpful. But I think there's a degree of distance between our panel and the regulatory system and the larger industrial apparatus, that if we were either a decision-making panel or we had some more oversight capacity, that maybe that would be different and we could learn more and get more engaged than a panel that is entirely a volunteer panel that doesn't have decision-making authority. So I don't know that that's the right thing to do, but I will say, just having worked on a lot of these meetings, that question of how we could ensure that we're more relevant and more independent has come up a lot. And I think the independence we continue to demonstrate, but the relevance, comes and goes because we don't have decision-making authority, and our major impacts have been in these two areas of community engagement. And that may be about right, but it may be that for future panels of this type that they need to be given a little more authority so that they can stay more engaged and more relevant. So I'm going to stop there. I really look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Just one clarification on the cask loading. Was the issue that the operations were poor, or that it was communicated slowly or poorly to the community, or both?
All the above. The operations were poor. Let's just say that for a while, my relations with the operator, Holtec, were very poor because I said publicly a lot of things that I think were accurate and very critical, and they were apoplectic. But operations were very poor, and there was a kind of cowboy approach to this, and that's led to a complete overhaul of the downloading operations, more monitoring, more cameras, more safety checks and redundancy, and so on. Frankly, more nuclear operations in a way that was a little loosey-goosey previously. I will say one of the things I learned in that process was that the kinds of best practices movement of ideas and best practices in operations across different industrial facilities that is normal for operational plants was not happening for decommissioning activities. That I think it is now happening to a greater degree for decommissioning activities. And then to make things worse, Edison did the operator did an extremely poor job of communicating accurately and in a timely way. And that the combination of the two was a big hole, and people stopped digging finally, and then they've climbed out from that hole. And I think we're more or less back to where we were before, but we should never have gone down that.
Okay, thanks. And sorry, I keep saying one clarification, but I have not a second one. You mentioned the transparency on the site boundary radiation monitoring and stuff. Did you as a committee was there some other pathway for people to be able to monitor the on-site operations? Like if you had wanted to go in and spend the day watching them do stuff, was that available to you?
Yeah, you can do, within limits. Can't just kind of wander in off the street, as everyone knows, but there are walking tours of the plant. They've actually walking tours have begun again with social distancing and so on. When this was getting started, some members of the community built their own Geiger counters, actually, and I went and bought a kit. It's been a long time since I read all the resistors, so I was like back to my boyhood. And so spent 4 or 5 hours in the garage building a Geiger counter, and a lot of people walked the plant with their counters and so on. That was a little bit of a stunt because those are not industrial and reliable, and the GPS units, had the devices out in the middle of the ocean and all kinds of other crazy stuff like that. But it was part of a trust building activity to try and figure out, for people to understand better the industrial engineering and where you want to do monitoring and what you can learn from monitoring activities and so on. But this is an area where there's a real disconnect between the professional engineers and the people who are listening to the public, frankly, because from a professional engineering point of view, it seems kind of insane to have a public-facing boundary monitor system for an ISFSI when there's essentially zero risk of any kind of breach that would trigger that system. And so I think a lot of people from that background were just scratching their heads, well, why would we do this? It just seems redundant and expensive and so on. And the reason you did it is because of transparency and public engagement.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, so I'll transition now to our second speaker. And so this is